Welcome aboard. I'm Captain Wayne Canning, and in this survey review video, we're going to be looking at a Beneteau 473. It's a 2003 model year boat. It has a French ID number, which indicates that the boat was probably brought over across the Atlantic on its own bottom. So it's definitely set up for European usage and brought to the United States. This is a pretty good typical Beneteau, and the reason I picked this boat is because it sort of illustrates a lot of typical things I'm going to find in a typical survey of this kind of boat. It'll point out some issues peculiar to the Beneteau and the French-made boats, and also some other things that anybody looking at any used sailboat should be aware of. So let's go ahead and get started. Let's go ahead and start by pulling up the survey recommendation list, and we'll go through that very quickly. And then we'll review over some of the photos and other findings in the boat. The first thing we come across in the recommendations is number one, there was no lockout device for the head holding tank discharge. This is a Coast Guard requirement, and I write this up on almost every survey I do. It's not a big deal. It just means that there's no way to secure the seacock in a closed position. And in another video I've done, I've talked about how to do this relatively easily. But because it's a Coast Guard regulation, I've got to write it up. So that's at the top of my list. As we pan down here, we will see. I noticed right off the bat that there's a sending unit in the top of the fuel tank, which can be seen in these pictures. And for some reason, the screws are out of it and missing, and there's fuel leaking out of the tank. So that's kind of important. Um, we also found that the seacock were in relatively poor condition. Now, this is typical of the French or European made boats. Their seacocks, they use a lower grade metal than you'll typically find here in the United States. According to sea regulations, through hulls are only required to last 5 years. So I'm going to say if you've got a French built boat or a European built boat and the seacocks have not been replaced, then that's something you're probably going to have to do. Also, the shore power on this boat was set up for the European 220 50 hertz system, and it hadn't been fully converted over to the US system. So that would be something that would have to be looked into on this boat. Starboard bow running light and steaming light were not operational, kind of typical things you might find on an older boat. There were some conductors and switches that were close to some fuel lines, and the backs of these switches should be protected from shorting, and the fuel lines should be moved away from high amperage electrical fittings, which is kind of a common sense thing. Okay, the shore power did not meet US standards. There was kind of this European plug in there, not really very well done. So that would have to be brought up to ABYC standards. The shore power cord on the boat was some homemade cord that didn't meet ABYC standards. There was kind of this weird splice in it that was taped to one of the stanchions on the outside of the boat. Not sure I could figure out exactly why that was done, but there you have it. Okay, propane system. That's another thing that's European standards are different than the American standards. And American standards, you're going to want a remote control shut-off valve at the propane tanks in the propane locker. That's ABYC requirement and U.S. Coast Guard requirement. Additionally, the propane line was connected inside the boat using a hose clamp. ABYC and U.S. Coast Guard require that all hose fittings on propane systems be a flare type and be swaged onto the hose. Hose clamps are not allowed to be used, and this is a pretty good safety issue. We certainly don't want leaking propane, so that needed to be upgraded. Another typical one I find in a lot of boats that I survey is that the VHF radio hadn't been programmed with the MMSI number and there was no GPS input. This is not required, but it's kind of a safety item. If you find you want to use the emergency button on the VHF, in a real bad emergency, just, press the button and it would send all the information. That's not available on this radio because it's not properly programmed and not connected to a GPS. Another item here was the battery was bad on the EPIRB, or not bad, but out of date. Again, I find this a lot. EPIRBs are kind of an important piece of safety equipment, and they don't always people don't always check the battery expiration dates. Now they will most EPIRBs will work long after the battery is expired, but nonetheless, it's a good idea to keep the battery up to date. Also, this had a Italian country code programmed in, so any new owner of this vessel would probably be better off to just go ahead and replace the EPIRB with one in the United States, assuming that's where you're going to use the boat. Let's see. We had some trouble with the lifelines. There were some issues on there, which we'll look at a little bit more. And you can also refer to another video I have on inspecting lifelines. But this is another common issue I tend to find on a lot of boats is bad stanchions, loose stanchion bases, and generally lifelines in poor condition. Going further down, we have fire extinguishers. That's another one. You want to make sure that your fire extinguishers are in good condition. Check the gauges regularly on them. They're relatively inexpensive, and I generally recommend they be replaced at least every 10 years, if not more often. We had some problems with aftermarket solar panel wiring. The wires were just kind of left exposed where they could easily be damaged or shorted. As we go further on down, we'll see the throttle cable on the engine was starting to come apart, and some of the cables were close to a steering cable, which could chafe on them and cut through your throttle cable. And as you can see, there's also some wires close to these steering cables, which I'll talk about more as we go through the photos. Okay, diesel fuel and other crap in the bilges. Again, that's kind of an indication that maybe the boat's not being as well maintained as it should be. Anytime I see oil or dirt in the bilges, it's an indication the owner's not really taking good care of the boat. Further on down, life raft had no readable label on it. Again, life rafts is something I find expired all the time. They're relatively expensive to maintain and have recertified. Commercial vessels require the life raft be inspected once a year. Um, Pleasure boats, there is no set time period. I generally suggest every 5 to 8 years. Depending if you're planning on some serious offshore sailing, you might want to get it inspected prior to that. The inspections are not cheap, and you kind of have to consider a life raft almost a subscription kind of thing. You have to amortize the cost of the inspections in with it. All right, further on down. And I break my lists into two categories. One is the recommendations, which are the safety issues and things that Coast Guard requires. And then I have what I call observations and suggestions, which are more just, maintaining the good condition of the boat. One thing I found on this boat, which wasn't made immediately apparent, is that the boat apparently had been on land and was blown over and fell off the stands. And there was some fiberglass damage due to that, which I'll talk about a little bit more later. This wasn't revealed right away, interestingly enough, until I started spotting some damage and asking a few more questions about it. The broker was like, "Oh yeah, I forgot to mention," and then told us about the boat falling off the stands. Well, that's kind of a little shady not mentioning that right off before the buyer went in to survey with the boat. There were some areas on the hull side. I'll show some better pictures of that a little bit later. Typical gel coat is oxidized and chalky. We find that on a lot of boats. Hatch lenses were crazed. Again, that's kind of a typical thing. The housetop skylights, I call them, they're not really hatches, but they're just ports to let light in. These things are really problematic, and not just on the Beneteau, but on a lot of different boats. I find these so-called skylights are difficult to seal and keep sealed with the flexing of the deck and everything. I've noticed that the hunters have a lot of issue with this, and even some higher end boats, I'll encounter this problem. But you got to be careful about that. That can leak and do a lot of water damage on the interior. Crap in the fuel filter, that's again typical and once again shows lack of maintenance in general. Um, yeah, the fuel level gauge wasn't working at the time of the survey. That's probably why they had it out and why the screws were out. So that would need repair. There was some water signs of water damage on the inside of the boat. I don't know if this happened when the boat fell over or exactly what was going on, but you can see there's a water line here on the water heater. And again, I'll talk more about that as we go through the photos. Water maker was disconnected, not properly hooked up, and no way to test it. None of the shower drain pumps were operational. Again, this shows lack of maintenance. So this is something you should be aware of if you're looking at a used boat. If you got a lot of pumps and stuff that aren't working, that should just be a warning light going off saying, yeah, this owner hasn't really taken good care of this boat. Same thing, cockpit shower issues with that. Black water discharge pump wasn't even wired up. So these are typical things you find. Starboard head pump was leaking. These Japsco pumps, they leak around the shaft. It's kind of annoying. For what you pay for these things, you'd think they could do a little better job, but I find that on a lot of boat with these manual hand pumps. There was a shaft sink fitted to the boat. Um, Probably and the zinc on the end of the propeller was completely wasted away. My guess is they had a diver cleaning the bottom of this boat, and the diver didn't have the correct zinc for the propeller, so he just slapped on a collar zinc. But that collar zinc was blocking water flow into the cutlass bearing, so that was a bit of a concern. And typical of the Beneteaus and some of these older European boats, and even some American boats, the sound material just kind of disintegrates after a period of time and was falling down and just kind of making a mess. Again, showing lack of maintenance in general. The batteries were not functioning really well, so they probably needed a replacement. Interior was generally in kind of rough condition without showing a lot of signs of maintenance. Some of the interior cabinets were actually dislodged and damaged from when the boat fell over on its side, and we'll be talking more about that later as well. Refrigeration wasn't working, issues with the AWI, hose chafing on the drive arm for the autopilot. And let's see, antenna missing, TV antenna missing from the masthead, cockpit speakers. You know, a lot of these little things, they're not a big deal if you take them by themselves, but as you can see, this list is starting to get a little bit longer. And at some point, the little things start to add up to where you got, a lot of it adds up to one big thing or one big pain in the ass, really. It shows this boat's going to need a lot of maintenance, and whoever buys this boat would have to put a fair amount of money in it to bring it back up to condition. Wind generator blades missing. I'm not even sure what it is with the lines and stuff hanging down from that thing, but mast deck light was not functional. Bilge pump, automatic bilge pump located under the engine. That's not a brilliant idea because if your engine dumps oil into that pan, the bilge pump is just going to pump it overboard. Why anybody would put a pump in there, I'm not quite sure, but it kind of indicates that maybe there's a problem going on there, and they're getting water under the engine for where they really shouldn't be. So again, we'll talk more about that when we get to the pictures. Typical windlass, cable remote in poor condition. One of the cleats was pulled badly and was actually at a bit of an angle, carrying on down. Bow rail was bent to the starboard, and one of the base fittings was actually cracking the fiberglass, kind of indicating that they may have had hard docking going on there at one time or another. Exterior woodwork was in generally poor condition, again showing lack of maintenance. One of the gas lifts supporting the hatch over the engine was weak, and I've run into this a lot. You got to be careful with these gas lifts; they will lose pressure, and the hatch will end up bonking you on the head. It's not fun. Standing rigging has no record of replacement or service. Loose gooseneck on at the boom, bad sheave on the at the end of the boom. These are the kind of things that most buyers don't really take a close look at, but they can really be a pain in the ass. And a bad sheave like this can jam up while you're out sailing and cause all kinds of problems. So you want to, if you are looking at used boats, take a close look at these plastic sheaves that are going to be all over the boat. I find a lot of them that are sun damaged, cracked, and broken. So you want to keep an eye on that. The jib was kind of worn and in a little bit of rough condition. It probably still had some life left in it. Little hard to tell from this picture. We'll look a little bit later, but there seemed to be a bend in the foil for the roller furling jib, which can make rolling that in and out a little bit more difficult. Cockpit hatches, some of the hinges were loose and some of the latches were non-functional or broken. Carbon monoxide detectors. This is another one I write up on almost every boat. I'm a strong believer in carbon monoxide detectors. Many years ago, I had a friend pass away on his boat due to CO poisoning from a kerosene heater. So kind of sticks with you when you see your buddy taken off of his boat in a body bag. So you want to be on top of that. Actually, some insurance companies require you have that now. So engine produced black smoke and soot. This is where I would recommend that you have a mechanic go over it. Apparently, I wrote down that the turbo didn't seem to be spinning up. Black smoke and soot when you're running at wide open throttle on an engine that has a turbo is kind of an indication, a classic indication that the turbo is not spinning up or operating. The engine will still run and it'll still get you where you're going, but it's going to burn more fuel and it's not going to have the same horsepower. There was a noticeable shaft vibration when running. I find that occasionally, but that's probably engine alignment or it could be a bent propeller shaft. Hard to say, but that would have to be checked out by a boat yard. Engine audio alarms were not operational. I think that's kind of a big one too. Most people don't pay any attention to their gauges. I know I don't. I'll look down at them occasionally, but it's not like a car where they're in front of your face all the time. So audio alarms are very important. All right, that's it for a quick review of the findings. Now let's go ahead and take a look at some of the photos for the boat. Now, as we can see, I first arrived at the dock with the boat in the water. There's a life raft on deck. Generally, there's no canvas up, so, in a survey, I would write that up as just not having canvas. And the boat wasn't in the best of condition, but I guess they washed it because it didn't look too bad. Here you can see the exterior woodwork is in pretty rough condition. This was a double helm boat. All right, interior. It's kind of a nice layout on this boat. This is, typical of Beneteau. They're fairly well designed. Nice light interior. Lots of room for sitting around, hanging out with your guests. A fairly decent galley. I'm not a huge fan of galleys in the walkway like this, but sometimes you just got to do what you got to do, and this one's not too bad. It is nice to have this opening door for the refrigeration as well as a top loading, because that's not going to be able to be used if you're out sailing. Couple of aft cabins on either side underneath the cockpit, typical of this design boat. Uh, Enclosed head compartment, nice little nav station, another aft compartment, another head compartment. I think this was up forward. It had twin, which is a little bit different. It had twin V berths, kind of split. I guess this would be pretty good for the charter trade business. More bodies that you can fit on board with a little bit of privacy. You can see it's a fairly roomy boat, fairly comfortable boat. You can have a lot of folks on board. This is a quick shot. You can see there used to be sound foam all up under here, and it is no longer there or falling down. Another look at the batteries, which aren't really installed all that well. It's got kind of this strap over the top of them. I'm thinking that strap's not going to hold up very well if this thing tips real bad. Another interesting little clue of a potential problem is they have this oil diaper oral absorbent pad right underneath this filter, which kind of indicates maybe they got a leak going on there. The battery cables, although they put red heat shrink on these cables, really should be color coded properly. Another thing they've done here, which ABYC doesn't allow anymore, is they've used wing nuts here. And ABYC wants you to use a regular nut so that you'll tighten it down and get a nice secure fitting on there. And there's no cover over the positive connections. So you can see how closely these terminals are and how easily that could be shorted out. So you'd want covers over that as well. I didn't put all this stuff in the report because at a certain point on a boat like this, it has a lot of issues. You have to stop writing everything up and just kind of move on with the big stuff. So again, we see this material is left over from the soundproofing material. This thing in there, this is an old style battery isolator, diode type isolator. They've pretty much been abandoned these days in boat work and boat construction. Pretty much everybody's gone to the new voltage sensing relays. The problem with this diode type isolator is you lose a whole volt going through them, which means the battery connected to that's not going to get as charged as the battery connected directly to the charger. Again, this is the bilge pump in the engine oil pan. Why you would put a bilge pump there, I don't know. And obviously, you can see whoever did it. This is some pretty low grade wiring. You can see this connector over here is just exposed to getting wet. Just a shoddy job in general. Again, another look at the batteries. And we can see there's a little bit of a crack here, and you can see some water damage here. This is from where the boat fell over on land. We got our battery switches here. Fortunately, they've put some, low-grade labels on there, but hey, at least they're labeled. It's just a charge controller, side view of the engine, and at first glance, you might not notice anything wrong right off. But this up here is going to be a problem, and we'll take a closer look at that. This is separated from the housing here. So this is a push-pull cable, and with this separated, there's no longer support for that area, and that could cause that cable to fail. It could cause it to fail with the engine in wide open throttle, or it could cause it to fail at idle. You don't know. So that cable needs to be replaced. Another view of the engine. Generally speaking, not too bad looking. I've seen worse as far as rust and stuff, but all right, a lot of dirt under the engine, speaking of rust, and we're seeing some corrosion down lower. There's another bilge pump here aft of the engine, kind of another odd location to put a bilge pump. And you can see more of this sound foam. This is probably where a lot of this dirt is coming from, is that disintegrating sound foam. And you can see the through hull over here on the right-hand side. They've actually got it sort of maybe partially closed. Why, I don't know. But obviously, yeah, I mean, you don't have to be an expert to look at that and say, yeah, that needs replacement. Also, if you look carefully around here, you can see this line here. It looks like all of this has been underwater at one point. Another clue that something may not be right on this boat. Again, looking at the through hull, and we see on the right upper corner more bad sound foam, just very dirty and nasty looking. Kind of a unmaintained fuel filter. This line here is actually on the outside of the filter, once again indicating some flooding into the boat. More bad sound foam. So that would all need to be replaced. This is actually the front of the water heater, although it's hard to tell, but obviously you can see that this has all been submerged at one point. And underneath this gray plastic here is where all the electrical fittings are. So the electrical fittings were all submerged underwater. My guess is this water heater is probably going to need to be replaced. You probably could replace the guts alone, but if the thing's been half submerged, the insulation is going to be in bad condition as well. Again, you can see this water line right through here and across the front of that, and then coming back down here. And you can see the rust and the film on these hoses. Classic indication it's been flooded. Even over here on the side of this larger hose, you can see the line where the water's been. There's been a fair amount of water in the bilge of this boat. You can see it on the exhaust hose here. You can just tell where that level was along the woodwork here. You can tell there was a fair amount of water in here. This is the plug for the water heater, just kind of thrown down in the bilge, not connected to anything anymore. Fuel tank, a dark area by the vent fitting indicates there's probably a leak there. You can see where these fuel lines are running like right close to the battery switches. And you got a lot of amperage and stuff going on in here. And you can tell by all these wires, there's probably a good opportunity to get a fire going there. I'd want something in between these switches, a firewall, so to speak, in between the switches and the tanks. And I certainly wouldn't want the fuel lines in contact with the wires and switches as it is now. Closer look at the sending unit. They've got it disconnected. The screws are laying there. Why they got this thing half apart, I'm not quite sure. And as we can see, there's a little puddle of fuel here. So obviously that needs to be fixed. And again, you can see these fuel lines running right up against the back of these battery switches. A lot of amperage going on there, potential for creating a lot of heat very fast, right up against a fuel line. The stuffing box and more of this bad sound foam. Again, you can see how deep, how much water got into the back of this boat. A lot of line there, line on these hoses here, line coming across this tank. It's clear this boat had a lot of water in it. Another picture of a tank, but you've got some straps missing from the tank, securing it in position. Carrying on, yeah, that's what I talked about, the leak on the heads earlier. Not a big deal, but again, you start making lists like this and all these little things begin to add up. Uh, this is just a mess. I'm guessing what they've done is they've tried to put in Y valves and stuff in order to meet US requirements, because overseas they don't have the 3 mile limit like we do here, and they don't have it down in the Caribbean. So when this boat arrived in the United States, they had to bring it up to US Coast Guard standards. And obviously somebody went crazy with the plumbing fittings to try to do it, and it's just a mess. More of that, and the shower pump in here was not operational. Part of a surveyor's job is to turn everything on and test it, and a lot of these pumps were not working. That's the overboard discharge pump, and it's not even wired to anything. I guess it's not much to see here, just plumbing. Again, we can see the through holes, some of these through holes. These are a little bit higher up, getting closer to the water line of the boat, but they're still in kind of rough condition. Fire extinguishers, again, they probably all need replacement. Newer ICOM radio, and again, as I mentioned earlier, with the MSI number and no GPS connected to the VHF. Another pump that just seems to be hanging there, and obviously the pump's not, the mounting on the pump is busted, removed, Not sure what's going on there. Okay, here we get into the interesting stuff. This is where we've spotted some of the damage that was done when the boat fell over. And looking at this, we can tell the repairs have not been very well done. That's probably not something I'm going to write up in the report per se, but it is something I would pull the buyer aside and say, "Hey, listen, I'm not really thrilled with the quality of this, but you can see they've got this mishmash all over the hose, and it's just smeared all over here. This bulkhead, I'm assuming, busted loose from the hull." And the way the Beneteaus are built, they use a methacrylate adhesive. Now, methacrylate adhesive is a special adhesive that's really very strong. Beneteau and a lot of the French builders use it a lot to bond bulkheads and other pieces of equipment into the boat. When this broke, obviously whoever made the repairs was unaware of what methacrylate adhesive is and just used this, which looks like resin and filler that they've thrown in there. Not anywhere near the same structural strength as the methacrylate adhesive. So that's a bit of a red flag there. Again, we can see some more of these, what I would term as substandard repairs. This is looking down in a tank in the bilge. They've opened up the top of this tank. So I'm not sure. I'm guessing that's going to have to do with damage to the hull underneath. This is an integral tank, meaning that cutting this open, you could probably get to the inside of the hull from there. More cracking, and this has not been properly repaired. You see this cracking going on. This is in the basically in the liner, but there's a structural member that runs through here. If this is cracked and they haven't opened up that liner, there's no telling what's underneath that, and it's probably not pretty. Again, this is another structural member, and it appears that most of the repair has been done just with some filler and not really properly repaired. Here's another clue that you can look at if you're looking to buy a used boat. This is a refrigeration unit, which was not functioning at the time. Look at all this dust in here. I'm assuming that this is not all just dust from age. This is when you see stuff like this, the first thing that comes to mind for me is fiberglass dust where they've been grinding inside the boat. So if you see something like that, a lot of that fine dust inside behind cabinets and stuff, it can be an indication that there've been some major repairs going on. Sometimes it can be hard to see, and the only remnant remaining is the dust. Kinked hose here, kind of a typical thing. This is kind of a cluster of hoses and stuff. Ooh, let's go back. There's a hose removed here and just plugged off with what I think is a piece of wood in there. All right, more fiberglass repairs. And again, without getting really into it, this does not look like some of the best workmanship I've ever seen. You've got goop and stuff on the hoses. If the guy doing the repair work can't be bothered to move hoses out of the way and not get resin all over them, there's an indication they're not doing a very good. All right. See, now this is earlier when I was talking about the findings and the zinc. There's supposed to be a special zinc fitted onto the back of hub of this propeller, and it's gone. Okay, looking at the hull, this is some more clues that most people won't notice, but surveyors or people who've been working on boats for a long time will spot this right off and know something's going on here. First off, you see this line has kind of disappeared and they haven't bothered to put it back. But what's even more telling is this hairline cracking in the bottom paint. This indicates that the bottom paint has been put on over fresh fiberglass, and the paint interacts with the curing and gassing of the gel coat and resin. It just doesn't stick to it quite the same as it does the rest of the bottom. If you see something like that, for me, that indicates I'm going to be paying close attention to the inside of the boat. You can see it here a little bit better. Again, we have that stripe missing, but more telling is these hairline cracks in the bottom paint. And you don't see that anywhere else on the bottom, just in this area. And this is where the boat fell when it fell off the stands. And this is where the fiberglass repairs have been made on the inside. A big deal. Again, we see that on the bottom paint in the same area going on. There's our shaft zinc. So we have a tube coming down here with the cutlass bearing on it. And that shaft zinc is crammed in between the propeller and that tube. What that means is that water can't get into that cutlass bearing. The zinc is blocking that off, which could result in premature failure of the cutlass bearing, which is kind of a pain in the ass. All right, picture of the rudder, another view of the cockpit. You can see that the rail obviously is bent off to one side, and you can see the angles are different here, and that's where we had some of the damage. This is that homemade electrical cord they had used. ABYC wants, a particular cord used. You should always have a store-bought shore cord. They're specifically designed for that purpose. Just grabbing some wire from the big box home repair store isn't going to cut it. All right, we had some slack in the boom, not a big deal. The AWI here was not indicating properly. Surprisingly enough, the rest of those electronics were working. Good compass. Actually, a boat of this age, I'd expect to see a big bubble in there, but there's not. Quick view of the sails. Mainsail didn't look too bad. Jib was a bit worn. This is that sheave that I was talking about earlier when we were going through the findings. Just if you're looking at a used sailboat, just be sure to look carefully at these sheaves and don't just look at them in a static position. You got to kind of loosen the line up and spin them around. It's not unusual for an owner or broker to spin that around so you can't see the bad section, at least until you get out sailing and something jams. You can see there's a bend in the foil here. Bend that high up in the foil, that almost tells me that maybe when the boat was hauled at some point, that hit the travel lift. Not 100% sure. It's a little tough to bend a foil that far up, and there aren't a lot of ways it can get bent. And you can see that forestay is fairly slack anyhow with the jib up. So, and we can see some loose stitching in here. The sun cover probably needs replacement. That sail needs to go to a sailmaker and kind of be refurbished. Another look at the wind generator. I'm not sure what all this crap is hanging from the deck. Our bent rail once again. Here's another thing I see a lot in boats I survey. This swivel here that's designed to go on the anchor like that. This is a terrible setup. And what happens is if you put a side load on that, there's no flex for that to flex sideways. It can flex up and down, but you can see the ears here will prevent it from flexing off to the side. If you're going to use this type of swivel, I always suggest or recommend taking a short piece of chain between the anchor and the swivel. You really only need 2 or 3 links, a shackle on there, and then this hook chain. That will allow it to pull hard sideways without twisting and damaging the swivel. I've seen these ears bent open so badly, it looked like the thing was about ready to pop loose, and they were still anchoring with it like this. Is where we have broken loose on the one side. You can see the tube is actually bent a little bit, and we've damaged the fiberglass there. Always pay attention to stanchion and rail bases. This is one thing most people don't ever take a close look at, but I find a lot of problems with these. I've got another video out there if you care to take a look at it on inspecting lifelines and stanchions, and it's worth 10 minutes to review over. This cleat, it's badly bent, as you can see. I'm going to say the fasteners holding that on are probably compromised, not to mention what could be going on below deck. That would have to be pulled and reset. Quick look in the anchor locker. Another look in the anchor locker, and you can see these rust stains coming down here. That's kind of a clue that something may be going on further up, so I'd want to investigate that a little bit further. Again, a closer look at the hatch that I had mentioned earlier about these skylights leaking. They've got some sort of substandard slap some sealant on it kind of thing. That Skylight really needs to be pulled and rebedded completely. Hatches, typical polycarbonate hatches, will craze like this from UV damage, and you see that on a lot of older used boats. We can see we've got a broken fitting where the vang is, and they've moved it to a lower fitting. So it seems like they could have just flipped that over, but at any rate. Again, this is our shore cord, and what this is I mean, yeah, let's go ahead and make a splice in a 220 line and then tape it to the stanchion with duct tape. If that thing shorted out to the stanchion, all of these lifelines and everything would be live. I mean, you could really get injured. This is cute, but I don't really know what it is and why it's there. They've jammed a piece of wood into this rigging roller. I'm guessing because it was rattling it and it was probably under motor. You know how these things rattle, and somebody probably grabbed a piece of wood and jammed it in there and said, "Hey, done." Which I don't know. Looks like our end stop is missing from the track. Another thing you'd want to take a look at: flares. Yeah. As a surveyor, it's kind of a running joke. You almost never find flares, running lights and flares. If one of those two, I'm going to find wrong on every boat I survey. These were, expired years and years ago. I'm a big proponent of the new electric flares. It just seems to make more sense. If you've ever shot these pyrotechnics off, they're kind of pitiful, and they're really hard to see in the daylight unless it's a smoke flare. But I think a flashing strobe light that'll run for like a couple of hours is going to do you a whole lot more good than these flares. And the strobes meet Coast Guard requirements now. So I'm a big proponent of getting rid of the pyrotechnics. In order to turn the gas on this boat, you have to actually go outside and turn it off at the tank. There needs to be a solenoid, a remote shutoff, a solenoid there to turn it off. And that's Coast Guard requirement. And this is just, I mean, what can I say? I don't have to tell you what's wrong with this. One look and you can see it's a mess. And vent hoses, this is another thing. These air vent hoses that go up and down like this, if they have low loops in them, they easily can get filled with water. I mean, I've done that. I've lifted the loop up and you can hear the water running inside of it. Well, if it's filled with water, air is not going to get through it, so it's not doing any good anymore. These vent hoses have to have a direct straight downhill run. Now I'm going to comment on this piece of wood here in just a minute, and this is important. You can see you could probably hold a gallon, maybe 2 gallons of water in this vent hose just in that down loop. That should never be looped down like that. You can see this hose has been so tightly pulled with this wire tie. There's few things that have wire ties on them in this boat. They would do it on this hose and crimp it. So there you go. You can also see these wires are awfully close to this, which is a somewhat rusted steering cable. You want to make sure that steering cables are clear of any wires on the boat. I once knew a guy, he lost his rudder because, I mean, literally lost it because the steering cable was rubbing on a positive wire and it chafed through the outer coating on the wire enough to where the cable was now energized with 12 volt. Well, that 12 volt hooking through the steering cable, that cable put that 12 volt into the rudder shaft, and the rudder shaft just ate away because of the stray current corrosion, and the rudder literally fell off. So a simple thing like a steering cable chafing on a wire costing thousands of dollars to replace the rudder. Lesson learned. Typical bad rusted hose clamps that you see on older boats. Again, you can see the steering cable is very close to these wires. That's the water maker for what it is. That thing is probably going to have to be completely rebuilt. Looking at this fiberglass down here, I'm guessing this had to come out of here to do the fiberglass repairs. And when they put it back, they just stuck it back in there and said, "Oh, well, we'll hook it up later," and never did. So I don't remember what the listing said, but it probably said, "Oh, it comes with water maker." Well, that's, matter of opinion. Okay, this is the steering quadrant, taking a look at that. They've got a fender stored down here, and this is the steering quadrant. Lousy place to store equipment. I have seen equipment block the steering. I mean, if this thing gets jarred loose in a heavy sea or something, your steering's suddenly going to be jammed, and you're going to have no clue why. So, don't store equipment near steering components. All right, this is one that you might not notice at first glance, but this is your autopilot RAM up here. And this is the ball socket holding it onto the steering quadrant. Well, you can see that thing's getting ready to fall off of there. It was put on at a bad angle going up, so there's a lot of weight and pull on that downward, but that's getting ready to fail. Is the arm for the autopilot. You can see it's been rubbing on this hose again. All right, just general corrosion. I'm not sure why they stuck a piece of wood in the top of the quadrant. Again, that would have to be investigated. I'm somewhat curious about that myself. All right, a lot of rust and corrosion there around the shaft, but we're starting to see clues of something else going on. See how this is white and that is not down here? See, this is the rudder tube that goes through the boat that supports the rudder. And there's a web here, a web going aft, and a web going forward. But oddly, the web going forward is not painted the same color. What that tells me is that piece of wood has been replaced and probably not properly replaced. Again, this is that piece of wood that I've been talking about. Beneteau has a history of problems with the way they support this rudder tube. Now, this one we can see is clearly glassed. Some of their boats, they've just used the methacrylate adhesive to glue these supports on here. More than one of these Beneteaus has been sunk because the bond broke loose and these supports came loose. And what happened is this whole tube starts moving. And when it moves, it breaks loose from the bottom of the hull. There's a lot of side pressure on that from the rudder. And when that comes loose at the top, that thing is going to be swinging back and forth like a pendulum, and it will cause the boat to sink. This is kind of an Achilles heel on these Beneteaus, so you want to pay fairly close attention to that. The fact that this one has had this forward piece of wood replaced is a real indication that there's probably a potential problem. It's nice to stick your camera inside of lockers and places where you can't really get your head and take pictures because, sometimes you can discover some interesting stuff in there. This is the manual bilge pump or emergency bilge pump. All right, this is our shore power inlet, um, European style type plug, and I guess they've connected it to their homemade cord. Usually, I'll just recommend have a certified electrician take a look at these things because it just becomes too much for me to write it all up in the report when there's a lot of issues like that. And you can see this boat just had hoses and wires hanging all over the place. I'm a little OCD about neatness for that stuff. Another look at the manual diaphragm emergency bilge pump, exhaust hose where it goes through the hull. Another closer look, this is that propane hose. Not only did they use a hose clamp, but they used the wrong size hose clamp, which is likely to cause that hose to not pull down securely around to make it go a little egg shape. More inside the bilges where some repairs have been made. Just kind of view of plumbing and wiring in general. Bilge pump. This is our oil and crap. Another interesting thing to look at. See this line here coming down here and it comes back here? That's an indication that something's going on there and this is becoming uh, broken loose from the hull laminate. And we'll see that a little bit more. You can see that crack a little bit. That's a warning for me. That's a red light. That's something that should be investigated further. When you see a flat strap like that, it's not for DC or AC grounding. It's for RF grounding. radio frequency. And the reason you have a flat strap like that is because radio waves travel better through, not through, but over the surface of a flat strap than they would a round wire. And that's why you see this flat copper strap installed in a lot of boats. And on the underside of this is going to be a ground plane. So that's usually going to be for a single sideband radio. Other interesting in this one is you see all this up here, signs of leakage coming down and puddling in here. These are the kind of things that you want to follow through, and you want to say, well, something's going on there. I need to investigate that further. Again, looking in the bilges, nothing too remarkable in this picture. This is kind of I'm not sure exactly what that is, but it's not the best way to install it. Was general look at the woodwork in here. Again, the varnish is in kind of bad condition. They've added vents down here. I guess that's for the refrigeration. I'm not quite sure, but we can see the keel bolts here, and they don't look in too bad of condition. Ground wire going to one of the chain plate attachments. If this is for lightning, that's a woefully undersized wire. So, but again, that's how the French do it. So, taking a look at some of the wiring and connections, typical the way the French connect all their wiring. They use these banks of connectors, a little bit different than how we do it in this country. Some people like it, some people don't. I'm not a huge fan of it, but look at that's our E-perb again. We have a horn right there ready to use. Blades that were available for the another sale in the bag. Taking a look at a water tank. Blue is usually water. Black is fuel on the French boats. I think it's also black water. Uh, Quick look at some life vests. Another view of the aft cabin, just general woodwork in general. See, now this door doesn't close correctly. When you find doors that don't close correctly, there's usually a reason for it. And I'm guessing this is going into the aft cabin. I'm guessing there's some misalignment from when this boat fell over. Quick look at portals. You can see this wire is in really crappy condition. This is for the remote for the windlass. And piling a bunch of rope and stuff pulling on it is probably not a great idea. Quick look at the anchor. They've secured the anchor chain to the boat with this little line. If that thing played out rapidly until it hit the end, I'm not sure that would hold it. I usually like to see a couple of feet of line in there to absorb some of that shock, and you'd probably want a line a little bit heavier than what they got on there. Just somebody's wiring diagram. Bad latch, another view of the bad wire and the remote. We got some cracking in the woodwork here on the exterior of the boat. Just a quick look at the engine hours. And there we go. We're back to the beginning. So overall, this boat was in kind of rough shape. I don't remember the price it was being sold for or whether or not it was the right value. And honestly, I can't remember if this boat, the buyer went through with the deal on it. But this could be a good boat with a fair amount of work. It's not one you're going to get into and sail off to the Caribbean in. It needs a lot of work on the plumbing, the wiring, the fiberglass work that has been done on the repairs really needs to be gone over by a highly qualified fiberglass person. I'm skeptical of some of the workmanship that's been done, but this boat in general shows some of the typical things you can find when looking at an older boat of this type. So hopefully you've kind of been able to follow me along a little bit. I try not to make these videos too long, but as my wife says, I like to ramble on a little bit. But hopefully we've covered a lot of the quick things. I'm hoping that by watching these survey videos that I do, it'll give you a kind of a better feel for the kind of things that a good surveyor will look out for and the kind of things that most people may not notice and your typical buyer is probably not going to notice things like that cracking bottom paint. Most people would look at that and not think twice. But to me, I look at that and I go, oh, yeah, something's wrong here big time. So it's the little things sometimes that can make a lot of difference. And it takes a lot of years to really get the skills to learn how to look at these things. But by following along with me on this, hopefully you get a little bit better idea. And if you're looking to buy a boat, whether it be a Beneteau or any other brand, by watching these videos, you can get a feel for some of the things that you might should keep an eye out for that you might not have noticed before watching the video. So hopefully it'll help you. Have any questions or anything, please leave them in the comments below. I prefer it when you do that because that way everybody who watches the video gets to look at the comments, and most questions are pretty good, and I can answer them as best I can, and hopefully everybody will learn. Again, I have to do the little self promotion. If you like the video, please click the thumbs up thingy. That helps with the algorithm and gets me more viewers. And I'm certainly would be thrilled if you subscribe to my Patreon page. I think it's $3, $5 a month. Not a lot of money. It does help me continue producing decent quality videos. So until next time, remember, the fun never stops when you own a boat.